Moshe and Tzetze were a middle-aged couple, and they had two middle-aged milking goats. Now Moshe, he was a davening Jew. And to daven, that means that you read and study and meditate on the Holy Torah, the holy book of the Jewish people. Because in that book, embedded in code, there is a path leading from this earth all the way up to paradise, the home of every person. And those davening Jews, they were the ones that would find that path back and lead the Jewish people out of exile back to paradise. So that was what Moshe was doing. He was davening, and he had known from his early childhood that this was his task, his life's task. His wife Tzetze, she did everything else. She cleaned the house, she made the bed, she cooked the bread, and she cooked the chicken, and she looked after Moshe's dinner. And she also looked after those middle-aged milking goats. But they were no trouble at all, because they were middle-aged and they were sedate. So every morning she just opened the byre and they went out into the meadow, and there they were feeding all day long. And when evening came, they wandered home again. They knew where they belonged, where it was warm and safe. They were not adventurous at all. And then she milked them, and they only gave a quarter of a pail between them. Enough for a middle-aged couple to drink. But one evening, they looked different. Their fur was shinier than it had ever been. Their eyes were gleaming. And when she started to milk them, they gave a half a pail of milk, more than they had done in years. And that milk looked amazing. Tzetze had to taste it, and it was delicious. Not only delicious, it was divine. And she had to give a taste to Moshe. And Moshe, he was doing his pre-dinner davening in the central room of the house. And there he stood and he was rocking back and forth to the rhythm of those words and those sentences and those syllables of the Holy Torah. He looked up into the ceiling, and he looked as if he was looking through the ceiling all the way up to universe. But to Tzetze it looked as if he was only doing his ordinary pre-dinner davening. But if she had asked him, he would have said without hesitation that he was not even in the room. He was climbing on a mental spiderweb, elastic spiderweb of thoughts and connotations and meanings all the way up to paradise. And he took one careful mental step up on that paradise, not to take any wrong turns and miss the path. And he was almost there at paradise. He could smell it, when suddenly out of the ether there stood Tzetze in front of him, and she held out a giant glass of milk, and her voice boomed, "Moshe, taste the milk, it is delicious." So stunned, Moshe took that glass and he drank it. But as it touched his lips, the path to paradise disappeared. "Oh, Tzetze, how could you? I told you that you must not disturb me when I'm doing my davening. You know, I wasn't even in the room here. I was halfway up to paradise. I nearly had found it. I had nearly found the way back for our people." "But Moshe, what about the milk? Wasn't the milk delicious?" "Ah, milk. It was only milk, good or not good, from two middle-aged goats. And delicious or not, what is that compared with our way back to paradise? I mean, what you saw here was only my fleshy shell. My divine presence was somewhere else. Tzetze, you're just a woman. You know from milk, and that is it. But don't you ever disturb the important work of davening that we men do." Tzetze was downcast. What was a wonderment to her was just beside the point to Moshe. And that evening they didn't say a word to each other. And next night when the goats came home again, and they were frolicking at the gate, and they were gamboling, and they were crushing their horns together, she didn't say anything to Moshe. And when they gave a full pail of milk, she didn't say anything. But the women at market, they said, "Your milk is delicious. We haven't never tasted anything like it. Where do your goats graze? So we can send our goats there, and they can also eat that grass and give the same milk." And Tzetze said, "I don't know." But then when she came home, she thought, "I should know, shouldn't I? Because they're eating something that makes them younger and younger for every day. Imagine if we could eat the same thing, we might also become younger and younger." So next morning when she let the goats out of the byre, she followed them into the meadow. And they walked past the most beautiful tufts of grass and herbs. They didn't see it. They had a destination in mind. And they went further and further up the hills. And they stopped outside a cave. And there they looked back at Tzetze as if they were beckoning her to come with them. And they disappeared into that cave, and Tzetze followed after. And soon they were engulfed in darkness, and she could only hear the hoofs of the goats. And she followed them deeper and deeper and deeper. And then the path started to go up, up, up. And after a while she could see light at the end of the tunnel. She saw blue sky. And when she came to the opening, she stood in front of the most lush meadow she had ever seen. And there were smells of roses and jasmine and lilac that she had never smelt before. And she stepped out into that meadow, and there were flowers that were taller than her. And they bent down and they murmured to her, "Moshe, Tzetze, Tzetze." And she could feel how strength came surging up through her limbs. And she was not old and middle-aged and with achy limbs anymore. She started to skip around and dance in the meadow. And she started to sing songs of praise that she had long, long forgotten. And then suddenly in front of her there stood an immense figure of light. She wanted to hide away, but it was too late. He had seen her already. "Tzetze, do you know who I am?" "No, not really, but maybe you are the God of our fathers." "Yes, Tzetze, that's right. And do you know where you are?" "No, not really, but it's nice here. Can I stay anyway?" "Yes, of course, Tzetze. You are home. Stay here." And then that immense figure of light touched her with his finger. And then she felt weightless. She was full of light and she floated in the air. She was full of ecstasy. Time stood still around her. But then she heard the goats bleating. And then she remembered the unbaked bread, the untidy house, the unmade bed, chicken, Moshe, dinner. I have to go back and do my tasks. "No, Tzetze, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Stay here. Send a note." Oh yes, of course, that was what she should do. She should send a note. And she grabbed into her apron pocket, she found a piece of paper, and she found a pencil, and she took it out, and she wrote, "Moshe, I am in paradise. Come quickly. We are all invited. Bring everyone. Tzetze. P.S. The goats know the way." And then she folded that paper and she found a piece of string and she tied it onto the string and she tied the string around the neck of the goats, and the goats went home and Tzetze stayed. And that evening Moshe came home to do his pre-dinner davening. He opened the door and he saw the unmade bed, the unmade bread, and the untidy house. Tzetse, tzetse. No answer. Tzetse. He looked everywhere. Then he went to his neighbors, but nobody had seen her all day long. And soon they were all looking for her, running back and forth, calling her name. But she was nowhere to be found. And each time they went past Tzetse and Moshe's gates, there stood the goats, bleating. Their udders were full, they needed to be milked. But nobody took any notice of them. And people searched and searched until darkness. And then at last Moshe came home. He was exhausted. But there stood the goats, bleating piteously. And he had to milk them. And he milked and he milked and he milked and he milked. And he had a full pail bringing over. What? You're middle-aged goats. You shouldn't do that. You must be late bloomers. What's happened? But the goats just bleated and looked at him with their kind eyes, and they licked his fingers. And next morning Moshe had no time to do his davening. He had to take the milk to market and sell it, just like a woman. And when he had done that, he had to go out and look for his missing wife. And then it was dark when he came back, and there stood the goats ready to be milked again. So now started a life of living hell for Moshe, milking goats, selling the milk at market, and looking for his wife. And one day his friend Feifel said to him, Moshe, you have to get rid of those goats. You can't continue to do women's work. You were called to David. You are the one that could bring our people back to paradise. You are 1 in a million. Give the goats to me. No, I don't really want to. They do remind me of my tzetse, don't they? But I suppose you are right. And so Moshe gave the goats to Feifel. Now Feifel, he was a butcher. And he did what a butcher does. He took one of the goats and he slit her throat. And then he hung her up to drain. And when he looked down on the floor to saw the blood pouring down, he saw next to that pool of blood a piece of paper. It was folded. And Feifel wanted to read it. He was curious. But his hands were covered in blood and he didn't have his spectacles on. He couldn't really do it. He better finish his work first. So what he did was that he just flicked that piece of paper away out of the growing blood of pool. And then he slit the throat of the other goat and hung it up to dry. And then he washed his hands carefully. He took out his spectacles and he picked up that piece of paper from the floor and he unfolded it and he put it in the palm of his hand and read, Moshe, I am in paradise. Come quickly. Bring everyone. We are all invited. Tzetse. P.S. The goats know the way. Feifel was so ashamed and distressed and embarrassed about what he had done. How could he ever again meet his friends when he had done this? And some people say that he was so ashamed that he folded that paper up into a little ball and then swallowed it. But he didn't do that. Anyone with the smallest ounce of common sense knows that he didn't do it. Because if he had done that, all of you would not have heard the story about the goats who found the way to paradise.